Hello, I'm Rhett Power, your host of Power Lunch Live. Welcome. It's a beautiful Tuesday morning, afternoon, wherever you are. I hope you're safe and healthy. And the point of the Power Lunch is today to bring on today's thought leaders, best-selling authors, people who are doing amazing work in the world that we can learn from so that we can get better at what we do. We're going to have some fun today. We're going to talk about culture, and we're going to talk about what's going on in society today. We're going to have a wide-ranging conversation today that I think is going to be really helpful and interesting. Now, if you like the program, give it a like or share so that your network can benefit from these conversations. We can also, I encourage and I hope that you ask questions today. We broadcast on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and probably other things that I'm not thinking of. Can't keep up with it all, but we do monitor those channels, and we do encourage you to interact with us and ask questions so that you can get the answers to your burning questions and again, learn from our guests. Now, today, I'm really pleased to have someone that I consider a friend, a colleague, and she is a member of the MG 100. And that group that I'm a part of. Amii Barnard-Bahn is a lot of things, but she is an executive coach, a consultant to Fortune 500 leaders. She's a former Fortune 550, Fortune Global 50 exec. That's a tongue twister. She's a fellow at the Harvard Institute of Coaching, and she is with us today. Forbes actually called her one of the top coaches for legal compliance in the United States. She is got her law degree from Georgetown and went to Tufts, and is a guest lecturer at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business. Amii, welcome.
Thank you. It's really, really wonderful to be here, Rhett.
Okay, a top Fortune Global 50. That's hard to say. So. We are in interesting times, and I think we're all sort of grappling with, post-COVID and then the needless or senseless death by the police, and which has caused all kinds of turmoil and so what. How are you feeling? How are you I know this is not a business question but how are you feeling about things, and how are you sort of coping with what's going on in society?
I am trying to keep hope alive would be I'm an optimist, but I also have always tried to focus my career on fighting for what's right. And so figuring out what that looks like. I was just talking to my daughters the other day about that, and working with my clients to make sure that in their organizations that they've got the right ethical behaviors and fair treatment set up. So I've been an advocate, and a lobbyist actually for several pieces of legislation in the past, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, and more recently the Women on Boards movement for gender parity in corporate boards. And so equity, you'll see when we talk about some of the questions that we suggested for this broadcast, that ethics and fair treatment and community and belonging are pretty strong themes in the work.
In your work and I guess in your belief system. It's a passion, I think, for you. Yeah. What does great leadership look like right now for employees and for external stakeholders?
Yeah, I think for employees right now, it looks like safety, number one, with what we've been going through with the pandemic. Safety is a primal human need, and no one can focus on work getting done without it. And I've seen that showing up with some of my clients. I think people are feeling a little better about that. There's been some progress. We have some protocols in place, some direction. Some countries have flattened the curve. So there's a little more comfort around that. But the second thing that I see come up after people think about safety is purpose. And with the immense changes that have been wrought by the pandemic, it's never been more important, Rhett, for leaders to rally their team around purpose, why they do what they do, and who it benefits. And for many, purpose has been disrupted, potentially permanently. There are businesses that are maybe no longer sustainable. There are models that have been challenged. You and I've talked about the conference model, for example, and business travel has been suspended, and certain industries have been impacted more than others in terms of, why do they do what they do? Do they have a customer base anymore? Are they going to pay that for the product? So leaders really need to get engaged and committed, and they need to step in and pivot where necessary to fill the void, the potential void that people are feeling of meaning. Personal purpose, I also think, is coming into view, especially lately, around a larger perspective around how am I spending my time and who am I working for and what is my life about? Because people have had more time to reflect. People may feel a sense of time left, is what I would call it, depending on where you are in your age. And that can lead to some very deep thinking around, am I where I want to be? How much time do I have left? How do I want to spend that time? And am I with and working for the people that I respect and that I care about working for?
That makes sense to me. And it's I think people have had some time to reflect on all that, haven't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then for external stakeholders, I think you asked about that. I think about that as customers, investors, and the community at large. And for me, there's three core elements for sustainability for that. And the first is having a really good core business strategy, which again, most people are probably revisiting right now. What are the core problems you solve for others and that people pay you for, and why did they choose you over others? And kind of projecting that out over the next few years. What shifted, updating your strat plan. I also think second is healthy workplace culture. How are you going to attract and keep retaining the best employees and to execute on your vision? And are you doing a good job at organizational justice and fairness within your own organization in terms of who you promote, what you pay, who gets special perks, whether it's working from home or that kind of thing, really paying attention to that in your culture, because things are moving more quickly, I think, than even before. And then the third that I think is so important for long-term company sustainability is good corporate governance, because this really needs to be an ethical bedrock. And good corporate governance for me, and this could be a whole other session that we do, but is around having a qualified board of directors, having a diverse board of directors so multiple viewpoints can be represented to enable your organization to have the best strategy and execution possible. And then also the board having a healthy relationship with the CEO. In a nutshell, I really see that looks like a board knowing when to give a CEO wings to try a new idea, to innovate, potentially to fail fast, hopefully. And then also to know when to put on the brakes, to be the ethical conscience of the company if they think that, something is going awry. And we've already seen the pandemic or any kind of crisis like this presents an opportunity to either show up great or to really publicly fail. And I think we've already seen some ethics heroes and zeros in the past several months, and they're going to continue.
Okay. What is, and you hit on some of those themes, in terms of going back to work. And you mentioned that there's some protocols and things that have been put into place and a lot of companies. How do we lead kind of going back to work? How do we lead that process? How do we, are there keys to doing it safely, you think? Are there any legal issues that companies need to be aware of in that process? I know it's state by state and city by city, and I know that that's a broad question, but just in terms of general themes that companies really should be paying attention to. I don't know if there's, from a compliance standpoint or what things that, because small companies, they don't have a legal team to
right
to sort of figure out some of these things.
Yeah, I'll start with a couple of broad concepts, and then I'm happy to get some specific, areas that companies should look at legally, if that sounds good.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
The first is I would think broadly about creating a culture of safety for connection and meeting people where they are. And if you have the luxury of not, if you're in a meat packing plant, there haven't been a lot of options to remote work. If you're in a tech company, you're on a totally different, or if you're in supply chain and you're manufacturing, that's challenging. And a lot of them had to just keep going. And so they're probably the forerunners in testing out the safety protocols. So I usually look to them in terms of literally what are they doing with work.
You can look. I'm sorry to interrupt, but so you can look outside of your. I mean, I look outside your industry and see what other people are doing and study that.
There's great information out right now, and so I read a slew of news headlines usually every day, and then I deep dive into what's important. And so look at the industries that are already back at work, how they're managing, what their protocols are. There's temperature checks. There's social.
I imagine your associations for these industries probably have good information out there.
I would hope that most of them would be coming out with some sample policies, protocols, things like that. Because there's been tossed around this idea, particularly in Silicon Valley, where a lot of my clients are, is that, we're going to work remotely. I talked to a CFO the other day for a client feedback review, and he said, the one thing that surprises me is we've learned we can run this company 100% remote. And it wasn't the focus of our conversation, but I just thought, well, I already talked to some of your employees, and that's not going to fly for them. They actually like, the office. And this was a classic Silicon Valley culture as well, with the kombucha on tap, and it's a community and family, particularly for the millennial generation. They've been raised and brought up that way. So just to yank that, not to mention childcare issues, elder care issues, just having focus. Some people need and want the community of work. So I would say that it should be a conversation buttressed by the infrastructure of legal concerns and safety concerns. So in terms of legal issues to check, I would say, number one, you should conduct a health risk assessment of your physical facilities. This should usually involve, if you have access to legal or compliance or health and safety people, great, have them lead the charge. HR is also a really good resource. The good thing to remember is this isn't the first time. It feels like it for a lot of people, but that we've had a crisis where we've had to worry about safety. Unfortunately, we've had horrible tragedies in the workplace, whether it's workplace shooters. There's always a risk of domestic violence in a workplace. I've worked with people on that. And then we've had pandemics and other infectious diseases in the workplace in the past. So there are some experts on this that can help you figure out, what risk really would be posed by people coming back into your workplace. What kind of protocols could you put in place? What's the risk? And there are some infectious disease cases from the past that will eventually come into play as companies struggle with liability on this. If anybody wants a copy, there's a really good article from the Association of Corporate Counsel. I could email them after the show, Rhett. The second thing I would do is talk to your insurance company about potential coverage for this issue. Insurance companies, they're trying to assess reserves right now. There's been, a lot that's hit that industry as well, whether it's wildfires or other things, but talk to them and see what they would underwrite for you potentially. Sorry?
Let me ask you this. Are you liable if somebody gets sick in your workplace?
I'm going to give you the classic lawyer response. It depends.
It depends. Okay.
It depends. This article that I can share gives some nice guidance around that. There's everything from causality, like, was that really the proximate cause of their illness? And there's some other things that would need to be proven. But yeah, or did reasonable care or reasonable precautions taken? There's all kinds of.
If you had a reasonable system in place, then you're less. Well, you can't say that really, can you? So okay, I get it. I just think that a lot of companies, smaller companies, medium-sized companies are probably struggling with that question, right? And that.
The last thing I want to mention on it, just one more point, is employee relations and ethical conduct issues. One thing I would be cautious of is being really fair and equitable and making sure that you're transparent around how decisions are made when you're deciding who has to come back to the workplace and who's allowed to work from home. Because if you don't pay attention, there can be a perception of favoritism or unfair treatment on who's allowed to come back and who's not. And that can run employment risk for companies.
How do you, what does that look like?
I would look at essential business objective criteria is your friend. So what are the actual business essentials of coming back to work? Is it a nice to have and they don't want to come back? Mm-hmm. And they might have a pre-existing health condition. I mean, I would look at all of those factors, not unlike a disability accommodation request under the ADA. There's an interactive process that happens in the ADA. I picture that being borrowed, perhaps, for this situation. It's a good process. It works. It balances employer needs for the legitimate business needs for the work with the employee's health. The second thing I would think about is I would really look just optically, try to do it in large chunks of people so that you can look across your organization and do a mental check and ask HR to help you with this. If you're in a large enough company where you literally don't know everyone, it's easier when you know everyone. But I'm sure we have lots of people on this call. You need to kind of audit who's getting allowed to work remote from home and who's not. Now, if it's your sales team and they used to travel all over anyway, maybe that's fine, but you don't want to only give it to men. You don't want to only give it to the CEO's daughter, Right. Right. You want to be equitable and fair. And you want to, my thing with this and with salaries, Rhett, is that large companies really need to audit this regularly because they just get too big to know the people to be able to be fair. But if you really want organizational justice, you need to take it out and look at it and run different checks and just say, okay, if this was printed out by accident in a public printer and some random employee, which happens, and some random employee came by and looked at it, would they look at it and say, huh, that overall seems fair? Yeah. They might be like, well, I wish I made that, or, I don't like the person or whatever. But if they're like, you'd want,
I make the same as everybody else in my kind of job or whatever.
Yeah. Right. Everyone goes straight to their job category and looks. And if you haven't been paying attention and being equitable, you're going to have some splaining to do.
Rightfully so. What you said about bringing people back is really, really important, and how to deal with people who may not be comfortable with it yet. And I appreciate that, because I think a lot of companies are struggling with that now. I mean, and is there good advice, other good advice when you're putting together a policy? Is it good to include the employees in it? Is that a way to avoid some of these issues and say, look, I want a team from across the company to come up with our kind of come back to work strategy so that everybody feels like they've been included in that decision. It's equitable. I mean, would that be one way to do that? Maybe, you think?
I think it's a great idea. I'm thinking back to when I did when I was a chief human resources officer and implemented a work at home and flexible work schedules for a team, and we did include, because you can get down a road and forget your constituency. It's like developing a product and not testing it with your customers first, right, to see if they even want to buy it. Because I've known companies that have implemented work from home policies and no one actually takes advantage of it after a year of work, approval by legal, approval by HR. It's crazy. So yeah, I would think it would be great to have, HR, legal, compliance, a representative from senior management. Most companies right now that I'm aware of that I coach have pandemic response teams. And so the return to work is a part of that. I think you need to assume a phased return to work. Again, I would probably start with what jobs are essential and then start a dialogue. Maybe all the jobs you determine are essential to return to work, everyone actually wants to return. Great, no problem, right? as long as it's safe, but maybe half of them don't. And then maybe you say, okay, when would you feel comfortable? What issues are you running into? And this is where I think culture has shifted. We used to keep a really strong line between personal and professional boundaries. Most people did. And that's gotten really blurred when my dog isn't here right now, but she often is. And I kicked her out because I didn't want her to start barking. But, kids can be running around. It's just people see each other's homes. There's been all kinds of things that used to be kind of private. And so I think we can actually there are advantages and disadvantages to that. But advantages, I think people can be more comfortable saying, I'd love to come back, but my mother-in-law is living with us right now. Her retirement home got COVID and we don't feel safe sending her back. So I need another 6 months of working from home because I think by then maybe there'll be a vaccine or we'll be confident about her retirement home. Is that okay? And an employer might say, yes, that's okay. And then they document that they made that exception so that anyone else who comes in and has a similar situation, that's the fairness, Rhett.
Right.
That's procedural fairness is actually thinking about it, and it being acceptable from a business standpoint. Because I do appreciate that businesses are needing to really be cautious of keeping the company sustainable so that everyone has a job. So there's always a balancing act with this.
Yeah, that you're absolutely right. That it is a complete balancing act.
Yeah.
And this question just popped into my mind. And if you don't want to answer it, I totally get it. And I don't know that there is an answer sort of uniformly, but we see this societal sort of, in a lot of ways, it's conflict. Do businesses have the right to say you have to wear a mask, you have to wear gloves, you have to is that something that businesses can do?
Yes.
Legally? It is? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that you can make that a requirement.
Yes. And I think that's backed up by, WHO, the protocols. Now, at some point, might that be relaxed? Yes. But right now, businesses.
So I can say masks are required if you're going to be in the bullpen with all the cubby, with all the,
Right. And just think of the meatpacking industry, which has been the highest risk of transmission, right? That and hospitals, is from my research. And that's because people are in close proximity. It'd be nuts if you allowed one employee not to wear a mask. And you're right, next to each other. I'm very involved in the arts. And sadly, the Metropolitan Opera just canceled its fall season yesterday. That's a pretty big bellwether. Just like, Harvard and I think Stanford announced all their classes would be online. Those are big institutions that we talked earlier, and you wisely mentioned about how you can look to your industry to see things. Well, look for analogies, right? If there are large populations, crowded, if you must go back to work, and I do have friends who work in manufacturing in the automotive industry in Detroit, and they started manufacturing masks to make sure that they had enough because it's a requirement. They get issued a mask and gloves every day. My sister-in-law. So, wow. Yeah.
I mean, but it makes sense. I mean, and it's good that they can sort of set a standard like that, and that has to be followed. It protects their people, and it also protects the organization. So that makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. What sort of a broader question that I've been really thinking a lot about lately, and I wanted to get your feeling on it, is with workplace culture. Mm-hmm. What is going to change? What is going to change? And on the other side of that, what do you hope changes?
Great question. I've observed several trends, a couple of which will be familiar to you all, and maybe a couple that are interesting to think about. One is, of course, increased remote work. IT infrastructures in companies that have allowed remote work have been invested in and changed quite rapidly. And so I think there will be a greater acceptance of remote work, which is wonderful news for people who had a horrible commute or who had living situations that were challenging. Can save time and money. And if it works for you and you can be effective, that's great. The second is, I think there's going to be an intense scrutiny of business travel, both because companies are going to, number one, need to recoup losses from the shutdown and from the pandemic impact. And number two, because a lot of people have pivoted quite well and realized that they've mastered online meetings, and that particularly large conferences, I speak at a lot of conferences. I've pivoted everything to virtual, and it's going pretty well. So the hotel industry, there's just a lot of questions, I think, around that and around budgets, business budgets for that. The third workplace culture thing, I think, and we've been discussing it, weaving it in and out, is this conflict over what safety looks like. I think that the reboarding of employees back to companies is going to create some organizational conflict between the organization's concerns and people's interpersonal concerns. And workplace policies may need an overhaul around that, as we've talked about. Fourth, and this one I've thought about a lot, I am curious and watching with interest the likelihood of the greater reliance on having quantitative data over qualitative data. Because quantitative data is easier to get, and that's all some people are getting right now if they've gone completely remote. And qualitative data is harder to get when you're not sitting near people in a group, and I'll explain what that means. It could mean who you think is performing well, how you measure that. So on the bright side, perhaps there'll be a measurement for results, which I think is a good thing because it is quantifiable, it's more objective, it can be more fair as opposed to just, schmoozing or who gets on well or who's buds, which can disadvantage certain groups that are not in power. And so I think that could be a good thing. We'll see. I'm curious about it, especially as a former compliance officer and ethics officer that, dealing with fraud and interviewing people and overseeing all kinds of workplace issues. And then the fifth I alluded to earlier is that near eradication of personal and professional boundaries. And there are good things about that. I think it could bring us closer. I know some work teams have really bonded and on a personal level, and that's wonderful. And it can also increase employment risk if the boundaries are blurred too much. It can erode some professional protocols that we've had in place that can increase employee relations issues such as favoritism or unfair treatment if it goes too far the other way.
Yeah. What would you like to see changed?
A lot. I'm always working towards it, but I hope we see more empathy. I hope we get better listening. I hope we're better at listening with this. And I hope we have a better ability to connect and to disagree in a productive, respectful way. That last one I worry about a lot because I strive in all my companies I've implemented, 3 ethics and compliance systems and HR and workplace culture systems. And I worry that collectively we may have lost our way on respect. And I don't think we've cultivated or valued debate and the art of diplomacy. And I feel that in the news. I see that on social media. And I know our mutual friend, Ron Carucci, just interviewed, did you see the Arthur Brooks yesterday? Yeah, Ron published a beautiful interview with him on a book called Love Your Enemies, How to Get Past America's Divided Culture of Contempt. And I really agreed with Ron's point that social media has fueled an addiction to contempt and a rise in factionism. And I think we're seeing that in the walkout of Mark Zuckerberg the other day. Even the Facebook employees are sick of being used as a platform. We've seen Twitter come out and take a stand on some tweets that it found inappropriate or violating, potentially encouraging violence or glorifying violence. But for most people, how to disagree respectfully is a learned skill. And I'm concerned it's a culturally lost skill right now. And I feel like, especially for the younger generation, we've got to step up and demonstrate that. And the workplace isn't a bad place to start, because everything you learn in the workplace you can bring home and can better you all over. So I feel like we need to focus on that, and I hope we do.
What you said something interesting in there that I want to go back to a little bit, that got my attention. about conflict.
Mm.
And I mean, do you think that this is the conflict is sort of essential, I guess, to getting to a better place? I mean, and then not the conflict that, not in the sense that we're seeing it, but this conversation that I think maybe some of this is going to force, right? That we've been maybe ignoring or putting off or whatever you want to call it. Does conflict help us get to a better place ultimately?
It does, when it's in a safe container.
Mm-hmm.
I think
What does that mean?
where a platform has been created in a group so that everyone participates
Mm-hmm.
in a way that's respectful and non-judgmental, and there's an active decision on the table, and the ideas are vetted and then surfaced, and then the team comes to a conclusion about a particular issue and takes action on it. And everyone's
everybody's had a voice in that.
Everybody's had a voice. So it's what I'll call procedural fairness,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you're heard. You may not get your way 100%. Hopefully you've influenced so that your opinion is in there in the fabric. But you know why the decision was made. You were there. You were respected, and you felt psychologically safe in raising concerns or issues. And at the end of the day, you made a decision as a team. And then once you leave the room, the idea is that you support the decision. You have unified talking points, particularly if this is an executive team we're talking about, and you support it. And then if there are follow-ups, or if it was the wrong decision, hopefully you revisit the decision. But I think people need to increase their self-awareness about how they relate to conflict so that they can be better stewards of that, both for organizations and for really moving us ahead on the social justice front. There's conflict, and then there's productive conflict. And continuing conflict just can spiral out of control if it's not geared and funneled in a strategic way to impact change.
I love that. How do you do that? I love that. That is so right. How do you get to that productive conflict? How do you stop it from being, does that make sense?
It does. I'm just thinking of so many contexts. Do you have a particular context you want to talk through? Because I've done it a lot, at a social level, and I've done it at a micro level, team level, corporate.
Yeah, like on a team level, right? Like, so maybe it's around going back to work, or maybe it's around decisions that have to be made in the next few months about where the company's going, and hard decisions around that. But how do you keep those? Because we're all scared, we're all anxious right now. We've got a lot more anxiety than normal. Our businesses have taken a hit probably, and so we're not operating in the same environment, and I think that's stressful. And so I can see, just like you see going on in society, it makes us more tense, and it makes us less. It's harder to listen when you're stressed out, right?
The amygdala gets hijacked, right? So we get lizard brain. So, yeah, it's impossible to think clearly.
Conflict is more likely, right? It's an unproductive conflict.
Right. I guess we can separate it in productive and unproductive. So I would say two things that I work with clients on. And then when I was an executive in companies, I would look to, one is a change management model and being aware of and respectful of change. And then integrated with that, making sure that I had the right inputs for a decision, stakeholder engagement, assessing who should be in the room, who should I be engaging with, and then engaging them, and then understanding and making sure they were aware of how they were showing up. Everybody has a relationship to conflict.
Right.
and we should know what that is. Some people avoid it entirely, pretend it doesn't exist. Some people move towards it. They're fine with it. They're easy with it. And then some people are kind of somewhere in between. And right. It helps to know where your team is on that scale. And there are blessings that come with each of those styles, actually.
Right.
What I've always, as a leader, I think the leader is the conductor of the orchestra, and you have these different instruments, and they have different gifts that they provide to the whole. And so if you think of your team members like that, then you'll know when to bring in your violin, and you'll know when to bring in your piano or your percussion. But you need to know what instrument they play. And what their go-to is, especially under stress or challenge, which is when our leadership derailers really show up. And a derailer is my term for, behaviors that we all have that don't usually serve us, and some of us are more aware of them than others. Great leaders are very aware of their derailers, Rhett. So they're no different than you and me. They've just learned how to manage them well. So like, oh, okay, that's my perfectionism coming up, or oh, okay, that's my judgment coming up, or my overly optimistic, being willing to look at the tough stuff coming up. And then if you know all that, if you know your reaction to conflict, you can play some really great music together.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I know that's I think it's something that can be helpful. Those kind of knowing the team and knowing the dynamics there, I think is really important to sort of making it productive. I mean, I think that's the way you get to really good innovation and really good decision making, right? I mean, if you as a leader or a manager, if you can manage in that way and understand people in that way, then I think you're going to be really, more likely to do better in this crisis than than a lot of other companies. Thank you so much today.
You're welcome.
This has been really fascinating, and I want to have you back on because I didn't get to half the questions that I wanted to ask you today, but we are out of time. But thank you for being here on the Power Lunch and spending some time with us today. You can go to the website to check out our upcoming schedule at powerlunch.live, powerlunch.live. That's the website. It's got our upcoming schedule for the week and the month. And we're going to have some great programs here in the next couple of weeks. Until tomorrow, have a great day. Stay safe. Amii, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Okay. We'll put, I want to put some links to your website and anything else you want to put up on afterwards so that people, I know you have some resources on your website that are fantastic, and we didn't even get a chance to talk about them today. I wanted to talk about your promotability index and all that other stuff. I didn't even get to the whole questions about career because of your background and HR, but that maybe we can come back and do another show just on those.
Okay. I can also put it in the show link. It's a great one because people are so worried about their career right now, Rhett. So I've created a leadership assessment, and people can get it by texting "promote me," the word "promote me" to 44222, and it's a free 82 question assessment on the 5 key elements that help get you promoted, or just a great thing to be investing in right now to keep your employability and your leadership up.
Let's talk about that and schedule that soon, because I think right now people are struggling with their careers.
It's awful. It's tough, but I've got hope. So I think it's a great time for people to double down. There's a lot you can do. People feel a lack of hope, Rhett, when it's something that's out of their control, right? So we'll be giving them stuff that's actually in their control and actions they can take. It's very, when I've done this with groups and teams, they feel great afterwards. So
let's do that. Let's do a show just on that, because I think that's a really important topic. And then we won't have to cover all this other stuff. We can just focus on that. That might be worth that. That's worth an hour right there, I think. But thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
You guys have a good day. We'll see you tomorrow.